Hello everyone, welcome to this game of Crazyhouse Chess. So my opponent has gone with the e4 opening, and now we are on knight f6. I'm gonna castle and play d6. So the idea is to attack the bishop. So bishop on c4 goes to b3, where I initially planned to capture, but I thought let's see what white plays after a waiting move like c6. In this position I want to go d5, so I try and defend the e5 pawn by playing queen c7, and I trade the bishop, and so I'm looking to attack f2, g3, all the dark squares, but I have a plan that involves taking on h3 and then going knight at d4, which would attack the queen. And after knight d4, I plan to dislodge the knight on g3, trade knights, and then play knight d4 again. But I mouse slipped and requested a take back. Unfortunately, I have to continue playing without any take back, which is alright. So yeah, I tried to win the pawn on f5 by playing bishop queen d7. However, I think I was expecting bishop at g4, which would defend the pawn, preventing queen captures f5. So after my opponent plays bishop at g4 in this position, I thought about trading, but I didn't want to give up the queen on g4, so I gave up the queen on g6 instead. And so yeah, I was thinking of bishop or pawn at h2, but there isn't really any attack, so I decided to capture the knight on g6 and go for a different type of attack. So yeah, I'm eyeing the light squares on h3 to go pawn at h3 in order to attack the bishop. So my opponent goes knight at e4, which I just trade off, and play knight at g5 again to go for pawn at h3. However, I'm not allowed to get pawn at h3 again, so I just trade off the knight again and rinse and repeat. So yeah, I expected maybe queen at g2 or queen at c7 could have been a good move for my opponent. But after knight at h2, I can't try and dislodge the knight in order to get the bishop. So yeah, I play pawn at g3 to lure the king forwards, and that would make it easier for me to go bishop at f4 or pawn at f4. In this case, bishop at f4, which intends to win a knight, but my opponent wisely doesn't give up the knight and goes king f2. So I try again to get this knight by playing bishop at h4 in the hopes that my opponent trades a knight and they still do not. And I've tried one more time going bishop e3, and still my opponent refuses to trade the knight. So in this position, I intend to win the f2 pawn. However, the way that my opponent played to defend the f2 pawn was quite strange, because now they've given up the knight, which I had been hoping for a few moves ago. And by playing knight at f2, I'm able to capture the queen. And do it with check. And queen at f2 wins the game. So my opponent requests a rematch, and this time I get white. So I go for 1d4, and my opponent plays 1d5, and then I go knight f3. I try to put pressure on c7 immediately, which is shut down by a6. And I go bishop e2 with the idea of castling. So I trade bishops. And go h3. So I thought I could play bishop takes d8 after bishop takes d1, and then recapture the bishop. After that, I try to play against the back rank by attacking the rook on d8. So I go bishop at c7. For some reason, I wanted to attack the d6 pawn as well. So, but my opponent wisely goes rook d7. However, I can then play queen at c8, after which I can pick up a knight, and the idea would be to go knight at c7 and maybe some bishop g5 move in that scenario. So I go knight. Okay, so I just took the pawn, which leaves the c6 knight under attack. I was afraid of knight a5, because that would attack the queen on b7. So my opponent goes bishop at c8, which is also another way of attacking the queen. And bishop at a5 wins the queen, in fact, because there's very little squares for the queen to go. So here I go. So my opponent threatens queen at e2, which would be mate. So I decide to uh, capture that bishop by going knight c7, which leads to a fork. So then I win a rook in this series of trade. And my idea is to go rook at d8. However, it's stopped by knight at c6. So I then go after the d6 pawn, but my opponent defends. And So yeah, I initially planned to go bishop at c5 in order to win the queen, but on realization, I didn't quite like giving up the bishop that early, so I delayed the bishop move by going pawn at c5 first, and then I would try and see if I can get the bishop move next. Yeah, so I'm not quite sure rook at d6 is the best move here, but my opponent doesn't reply, and that's actually quite interesting because if they had captured the rook, I would then have a much closer pawn to the king. So here I just try to win as much pieces as I can before going for any attacks. And the idea is that after bishop e5, I can take g7. Yeah, I had knight f6, which would win one of the queens. But for some reason, I was scared of black getting attack, so I decided to castle quickly. So after castles, my opponent goes knight at e2, and they try to mount an attack on my king. And I felt I needed to play defensively here, and perhaps there is a much stronger move like pawn at h6 or bishop at h6, or there could be rook takes d7, but I decided to go after the knight because I was afraid of some pawn at g3 or some pawn at g1 kind of move that would then send my king into a dangerous square. I fully expected the capture on d6, but my opponent doesn't capture, so I'm able to win the knight. And in the case that they take on d6, I can attack the queen and get a tempo. And this makes it quite difficult because now f6 is really weak, and I have a spare knight, which means I can play knight at f6, captures, and go after the queen on d8. I decide to play safe still, just blocking any um, potential bishop moves on the diagonal. And because I have a bishop still, I'm able to play pawn at h6, and the idea is to go pawn at g7, and it's very difficult to stop. So my opponent rightfully gives up one of the rooks, and I decide it's good to win that rook, and then I'm able to get the queen with check. So now I have two queens, and I play queen at g7, which is a checkmate. End of the game.